There is a small detail in regular show that most people watch past without ever stopping on it, and it is this. The Yeti who works at the park, the one everybody calls Skips, is not actually named Skips. That is not his real name. It is something he chose for himself, on purpose, a long time ago, after something happened to him that the show waits 5 seasons to fully explain. Tonight, that is where we are going to start, because it is small, and because it is true, and because once you understand why a 500-year-old immortal changed his own name rather than keep the one he was born with, almost everything else about this show starts to look different. I am Velvo, and tonight we are walking slowly through the mysteries and theories of regular show, the ones the show actually confirms, and the ones that only live in the space between episodes. So, get comfortable. Turn the lights down low if you have not already. This is a show about two guys who avoid work at a park, and somehow, if you sit with it long enough, it turns into one of the most quietly devastating pieces of television Cartoon Network ever put its name on. His real name was Walks. He was a young man once, not a monster, not a myth, just a kid, at a school called Bennett High School, sometime around the year 1814, which the show states plainly and which is worth sitting with for a second, because it means the character we have spent years watching putter around a maintenance shed in a golf cart has memories older than most nations currently on a map. At that school, he fell in with a small circle of friends who called themselves the Guardians of Eternal Youth, immortal beings who looked, and still look today, in the present-day timeline of the show, like large infants with unsettling adult voices. He also, in that same stretch of his life, met a girl. Her name was Desdemona. Everyone called her Mona. The show does something it rarely allows itself to do with a supporting character's backstory, which is slow all the way down and let a romance breathe. Walks and Mona meet by chance at lunch. She decorates a school dance with him. He learns in her company how to be handy with his hands, how to fix things, the exact skill that will define the rest of his working life at the park centuries later. There is a bully at that school, a towering, monstrous figure named Clorgbane the Destroyer, and Walks promises Mona he will not fight him, because Mona does not like violence, and for a while, he keeps that promise, even as Clorgbane terrorizes the people around him. The Guardians hand him a set of gauntlets called the Fists of Justice, built specifically because no ordinary strength could touch Clorgbane, and Walks turns them down because he made a promise. It is only at the dance itself, when Clorgbane loses patience and comes looking for him, that the fight finally happens, and it happens badly. Walks, throws, punches that do nothing. Clorgbane strikes him down with a single blow. And when Clorgbane raises his weapon to finish him off, Mona throws herself in the way. A piece of the ceiling comes down where she is standing. She dies in the same room where they had been dancing minutes before. That is the canonical origin of the character. It is not a theory. It is not a reading between the lines. The show states it directly in an episode called Skip's Story, and it treats the material with a seriousness that borders on somber for a series otherwise built on video game jokes and pizza monsters. What follows is smaller and quieter, and somehow the part that stays with people longest. Years after Mona's death, the Guardians of Eternal Youth return to Walks and offer him immortality, on the condition that he take up the Fists of Justice permanently and fight Clorgbane again every 157 years, for as long as the world needs him to. They warn him what immortality actually costs. Everyone he loves from this point forward, they tell him, will eventually grow old and die while he does not. He tells them, without much hesitation, that he has already lost the only person he ever loved that way, so the warning does not really apply to him anymore. And then, in the quiet grief of that moment, he decides on a new name, not walks, skips, because he and Mona used to skip together back when things were good, back before the ceiling came down, and from that day forward, he refuses to simply walk anywhere ever again. Every single footstep he takes for the rest of his impossibly long life is, technically, a small act of memory. He is not choosing a silly gait for a cartoon Yeti to make children laugh. He is performing a private, wordless tribute to a girl who has been dead for centuries, every single time he moves across a room. If you have made it this far into the video, go ahead and drop a comment letting me know where you are watching from tonight and what time it is where you are. I always like picturing where these get watched. Somebody's basement in Ohio at 1 in the morning. Somebody's bedroom in Manila where it is already tomorrow. Somebody driving home late and just listening. Wherever you are, get comfortable, because we are going a lot deeper than a groundskeeper's origin story tonight. Once you know that about Skips, a second, quieter mystery starts to nag at you, which is that he is not the only character in this show carrying a name that is not really his own, and not the only one whose actual identity the show seems oddly reluctant to spell out. Consider High Five Ghost. He is dead. He has been dead for the entire run of the series. Nobody at the park treats this as strange. Nobody asks how he died. The show never tells you. Not in a flashback episode, not in a passing line of dialogue, not in a Halloween special where you might expect the subject to finally come up. His actual birth name is never given either, at least not on screen in the finished series. He is simply High Five Ghost, the nickname his friends use, because he floats around holding up a translucent hand for a slap that almost never lands. He has a brother. He eventually has a wife. He settles into a small, stable, contented domestic life that the show treats with the same warmth it extends to every other happy ending in its finale. And the show simply never explains the central biographical fact of his existence. This is, as far as anyone has been able to determine from the credited writers, the wiki, or the show's own text, an actual unresolved gap, rather than a secret, with a hidden answer waiting to be found if you look closely enough. It is worth being honest about that distinction, because a lot of what gets called a mystery online is really just a theory wearing a mystery's clothes. This one is the real thing. Nobody currently knows how High Five Ghost died, including, as far as public record shows, the people who wrote him. It is worth sitting for just a moment longer with how strange it actually is that a comedy this committed to lightness let itself write a scene like the one in Skips' story at all. There is no joke waiting at the end of Mona's death. The show does not cut to a punchline to relieve the weight of it, the way it might in almost any other episode. Mordecai and Rigby, listening to the story from the present-day framing device the episode uses, are shown visibly fighting back tears of their own, and the episode simply lets that sit on screen for a beat longer than a typical 11-minute Cartoon Network episode usually allows itself. It is one of the clearest early pieces of evidence, well before the finale ever confirms just how far this show was willing to go, that regular show had decided, quietly and without ever really announcing it, that comedy and genuine grief were not actually in competition with each other, and that a show could ask you to laugh at a raccoon's terrible plan one week and cry over a 500-year-old man's dead girlfriend the next, without either mode undercutting the other. What is interesting is what fans have built in that empty space, because empty space in a beloved show never stays empty for long. One reading, and I want to be honest, that this is fan interpretation and nothing the show itself confirms, is that his death is left unexplained on purpose, structurally, because the point of the character was never the mechanism of his death, but the fact of his afterlife. He is proof, in this reading, that the park is a place where death is negotiable rather than final, and giving him a specific cause of death would turn him into a ghost story with a beginning, middle, and end, when what the show actually wants from him is a permanent, unremarked upon presence, a walking piece of evidence that whatever this park actually is, it does not obey the same rules everywhere else does. That is speculation. It is a good reading, and it is consistent with how the show treats him, but it is not something G. Quintel, or any writer has stated as intent, so hold it loosely. What can be stated with more confidence? Because the show simply shows you this over and over across its run, is that death at this specific park behaves nothing like death anywhere else. Rigby, the raccoon half of the show's central duo, dies on screen multiple separate times across the series and comes back every single time, sometimes through a literal wrestling match with the personification of death himself, sometimes through some other cosmic loophole the show does not bother explaining. Death, as a character, is a recurring presence at the park, a British accented biker with a wife and a son who shows up to collect souls and who has, on more than one occasion, been talked, tricked, or beaten into giving one back. This is not subtext. It is plot. The show simply lets its main characters die and be resurrected as a fact of the setting, the way another show might let its characters get a flat tire. And once you start counting the instances, the pattern becomes hard to treat as coincidental set dressing. Which brings us, carefully, into the deepest and most consequential fact this show ever reveals about itself, the one that recontextualizes literally every episode that came before it. Once you know it, the truth about Pops. For 7 seasons, Pops Maillard is the show's gentlest joke. He is a lollipop-headed old man in a black vest and a top hat who lives in a mansion at the top of the property, speaks in an exaggerated, almost Victorian formal cadence, and reacts to the ordinary confusions of adult life with a kind of permanent, delighted bewilderment. He does not seem to do any actual work at the park. He is treated by everyone, including the audience for a very long time, as comic relief with a good heart and not much else going on underneath. Then, in the back half of the 8th and final season, the show reveals, plainly and without irony, that Pops is not human, was never human, and never actually aged the way the show had let you assume he did. His birth name is Megacranus. He was born on a planet called Lollyland, created, according to the show's own mythology, as what the natives of that world describe as the perfect embodiment of good. And because that kind of absolute goodness cannot exist without something to balance it, an opposing being was created alongside him, Malum Cronus, whom Mordecai and Rigby, on first encountering him, nickname Anti-Pops. The two of them are fated, according to the show's finale, to fight one another for the fate of the universe roughly every 14 billion years, and every single time, across what the show implies, has already been dozens of prior cycles. The fight has ended in an exact stalemate, a mutual blow that resets the entire universe and starts everything over from scratch. This is canon. The show states it directly in its final season. It is not a theory, and it is worth pausing on just how strange a thing that is to learn about a character you have spent years watching lose at ping pong and get confused by vending machines. What the finale then does with that revelation is where the show earns whatever reputation it has for being braver than its premise ever advertised. Antipops arrives with bounty hunters. The park crew travels to Lollyland itself, where the natives explain the terms of the ancient conflict and show the assembled group physical records of the previous battles, going back further than anyone present can really comprehend. Knowing that every past cycle has ended in a draw, Mordecai comes up with a plan: rig the confrontation so that, for the first time in the entire history of this cosmic rivalry, Pops actually has an advantage. Pops, reluctant but out of options, agrees. What follows is chaotic, in exactly the way a series finale that has decided to go for broke tends to be chaotic. Bounty hunters. A villain named Streaming, who shows up chasing an unrelated grudge and ends up aiding Antipops almost by accident. Nearly the entire supporting cast of the show's 8-season run returning for one last appearance, merging into a single giant robot to hold the line while Pops and his brother settle the actual fight between them. Antipops eventually loses patience and grows into a titanic form, erasing almost everyone present from existence, sparing only Mordecai and Rigby, which forces Pops to match him, growing into his own titanic form in turn. And here is the detail that, once you know it, changes how you watch every quiet moment Pops has in earlier seasons. The way the fight is actually resolved is not through greater force. Pops, badly outmatched even with his new advantage, does something the show has been quietly building toward the entire time without ever announcing it. He embraces his brother, not as a wrestling move, as an actual hug, delivered with what the show frames, through years of earlier setup about Pops's character, as genuine brotherly love, the kind of love that has nowhere else to go. After billions of years of exactly this same fight, happening exactly the same way, that embrace weakens Antipops's negative energy, buys the moment needed to finish him, and ends the cycle for good. But it costs Pops his life. He dies giving his brother, and by extension, the universe, the one thing 14 billion years of cyclical violence had apparently never once tried. The show does not soften that. Mordecai and Rigby are shown crying, on screen, without the show cutting away to a joke to relieve the tension. The sequence that follows is set to David Bowie's Heroes, chosen in part, according to public reporting at the time, as a tribute to Bowie himself, who had died roughly a year before the episode aired. The park returns to Earth, and the show then does something almost no other animated comedy aimed at a general audience was willing to do at the time. It jumps forward, not by a season, but by a full quarter of a century, showing the remaining cast as adults with careers, spouses, children, and the accumulated, unglamorous texture of an entire lifetime that Pops's death purchased for them. The very last image of the series is Pops himself, in what the show frames as a kind of afterlife, watching the lives of his old friends play out on what is essentially a home movie. Content, at peace, having apparently gotten exactly the ending he wanted for the people he loved, even though it meant not being there to see it happen in person. If you want to read that as a religious allegory, the shape is sitting right there for you to notice. A being of near total goodness, born to a fight he did not choose, raised in secret by a guardian who loved him as a son, who ultimately gives himself up in an act that ends a cycle of destruction the universe could not otherwise escape. I want to be careful and clear that this is an interpretation, not a stated intention of the creators, and that it is likely resonant not because the writers were building a specific theology, but because that particular story shape, self-sacrifice, ending an inherited cycle of violence, is old enough and common enough across human storytelling that audiences recognize its emotional weight instinctively without needing anyone to spell out where it comes from. What is not interpretation, what is simply the text of the show, is that Pops chooses tenderness as his actual weapon in the one moment where tenderness had never once been tried before across billions of years and dozens of cycles, and that this choice, and not superior strength, is what ends the war, which leads directly into the second half of this particular mystery, the one that sat underneath the show for 7 full seasons before the finale ever confirmed it. What exactly was Mr. Maillard hiding, and why? Mr. Maillard, voiced for the entirety of his run by the late David Ogden Stiers, is introduced early in the series as a stock type any workplace comedy would recognize instantly. He owns the park. He is short, wrinkled, greenish skinned, perpetually irritated, and seems to have made it a personal habit never to learn Benson's actual name, calling him Beanhead, Ball Bucket, Biantine, almost anything except the correct word across dozens of appearances. He is, by every surface signal the show gives you for years, simply a mean, cheap, thoughtless boss's boss, the kind of authority figure whose function is comic irritation rather than depth. Then, in an episode late in the run called The Ice Tape, the show reveals the actual history underneath that irritation, and it recontextualizes every prior appearance the character has made. Long before the events of the series, Mr. Maillard worked as a meteor fragment salesman. On one expedition, he found an asteroid, and inside that asteroid was a baby. That baby had come from Lollyland, though Maillard could not have known the full weight of what he was holding at the time. He named the child Pops because, as the show plays it, the baby's head simply already looked old, lollipop-shaped, and strange from birth. He adopted him. He built, or at minimum purchased and secured, an entire public park, specifically as a place where his adopted son could grow up in something resembling a normal environment, safely obscured inside the ordinary rhythms of groundskeeping, video game tournaments, and small workplace disasters. Everything about the park's daily operation, in this light, sits on top of a decades-long act of quiet protection that Mr. Maillard never once explains to the people actually doing the work. Here is where a fair amount of what circulates online tips over from documented plot into speculation, and it is worth separating the two carefully because the emotional core of the character depends on getting that separation right. It is stated, on screen, that Maillard found Pops as a baby and raised him without knowing, at least not with certainty at the outset, the full scope of what his son would eventually have to face. What is not stated on screen, and is instead an interpretation fans have built from the tone of his later scenes, is the idea that Maillard secretly knew from the very beginning exactly what Pops was destined for, and spent his entire life bracing for a loss he could see coming decades in advance. The show supports that reading strongly through the way Maillard's tenderness toward Pops never fits anywhere else in his otherwise gruff and irritable personality. Through the specific way he goes quiet and strange in certain scenes involving his son, and through the ice tape itself, in which he directly tells Pops that he always considered him his real son, regardless of where he came from. But whether Maillard knew from day one or came to understand it gradually is left genuinely ambiguous by the text and the more emotionally generous reading that a frightened, ordinary man spent his whole life quietly preparing a child he loved for a fight he could not prevent and could barely understand himself, is, I think, the one worth sitting with, precisely because it does not require him to have known everything. It only requires him to have loved someone enough to keep trying anyway. What the show does confirm, plainly, is what this cost him. Pops dies in the finale during the fight in space. Maillard is not there to see it happen. When the park eventually returns to Earth after the 3-year absence the finale's own internal timeline establishes, Mordecai notices Maillard simply staring up at the sky, grieving, saying nothing. In the years that follow, within the 25-year time skip, the finale stages for its remaining cast, Benson becomes Maillard's caretaker, and Maillard eventually leaves him both his possessions and ownership of the park itself, apparently regarding Benson, after everything, as the person closest to him besides the son he lost. Maillard dies himself shortly before the 25-year reunion the show depicts near its final minutes, and the last image the show gives its audience of him is a statue erected in his honor, placed directly beside the statue of Pops. Two lollipop-headed figures, father and son, standing together in bronze or stone at the edge of a park that spent decades quietly functioning as a hiding place, neither of them ever called by that name out loud. There is a small wry detail worth including here, because it is the kind of thing that only becomes visible once you already know the ending. Mr. Maillard's surname is widely understood, based on how the character and his design are described, to be a reference to the Maillard reaction, the actual chemical process responsible for browning and caramelizing sugar, the exact reaction that produces the kind of hard candy his own lollipop-headed body visually resembles. It is a small joke buried in a name, sitting quietly underneath one of the most genuinely sad character arcs the show ever completes, and it tells you something true about how this series worked at its best. Even its punchlines were frequently doing more structural work than they got credit for at the time. Now, having gone as deep as the show's mythology actually goes, it is worth stepping back and dealing honestly with a mystery that is not about lore at all, but about the mechanics of who was actually speaking to you across all those years. Because the voice cast of regular show contains one detail that gets repeated online constantly, almost always slightly wrong, and it is worth setting the record straight. The correct version, verified plainly by the show's own credits, is this. Sam Marin voices 3 of the park's central characters, not 4. He is Benson, the anxious, permanently exasperated gumball machine manager. He is Pops, the gentle cosmic being none of us knew was a cosmic being for most of the show's run. And he is Muscle Man, the loud, insecure, deeply loyal green-skinned prankster whose entire personality is built around performing a toughness he does not actually have. 3 characters, 1 performer, each of them occupying a genuinely different emotional register. Anxious middle management, wounded innocence, and defensive bravado. High Five Ghost, who is frequently and incorrectly lumped in as a 4th Marin role in casual online summaries, is actually voiced by J.G. Quintel himself, the show's creator, who also, of course, voices Mordecai. That means the show's 2 lead protagonists and its most enigmatic supporting character, the ghost nobody explains, all come out of the same mouth as the man who created the entire show, while a second, entirely separate performer is quietly responsible for the boss, the god, and the loudest guy in the room. Once you know the correct distribution, a genuinely interesting interpretive question opens up, and I want to be clear that everything from here forward on this particular point is reading, not confirmed authorial intent. If you take Sam Marin's three characters together, Benson, Pops, and Muscle Man, you get something like three different coping strategies laid out side by side: anger as a management style, gentle avoidance as a survival strategy, and performance as a shield against being taken seriously enough to be hurt. It is tempting, and fans absolutely have made this argument in forums and video essays, to say the show is quietly suggesting these three men are variations on a single underlying emotional structure, given a shared voice almost as a wink to the audience. It is a satisfying reading. It is also almost certainly not what happened during casting, which by every practical account was driven primarily by which actors in the room could reliably deliver which vocal ranges and comic rhythms under the time and budget constraints of an independently pitched Cartoon Network Studios pilot with a very small crew. The thematic resonance, if it is there at all, is likely something the show grew into rather than planned from day one. But resonance does not require intention to be real, and it is genuinely true that when Pop speaks, and then Benson speaks, and then Muscle Man speaks, you are listening to the same human instrument being asked to perform softness, authority, and bravado in the same 22 minutes, and the effect on an attentive viewer is not nothing. From here, it is worth addressing one of the most persistent and most frequently mischaracterized mysteries in the entire fandom. Why did this show actually end, and was it canceled? The honest, documented answer is that regular show was not canceled. J.G. Quintel has said directly, in interviews given around the time of the finale, that he had told Cartoon Network for years that he simply wanted advance warning if the network was going to stop renewing the show, because he did not want to be caught off guard and have the series simply stop without the chance to build a proper ending. Around the middle of the show's 7th season, the writing staff began to sense that the show's next renewal, whenever it came, would likely be smaller than previous ones. And Quintel has described that as the moment the team started actively planning toward a conclusion, rather than simply continuing episode by episode indefinitely. This is worth being precise about, because it separates two very different situations that get flattened together online constantly. A show being abruptly canceled by a network with no warning versus a show's creator sensing the runway shortening and choosing, deliberately, to use the time that remained to build the ending he actually wanted. Quintel has been direct that the second version is what happened. He wanted to end it his way, on a high note, rather than let it keep running until the material or the energy behind it started to genuinely decline. That decision shaped the entire final season's structure. The show had, by that point, produced well over 250 episodes across roughly 7 years, and the writers, by Quintel's own account, had begun to feel they were repeating structures they had already explored fully. Rather than treat the final season as more of the same, the show committed to something it had never really attempted before: genuinely serialized, sequential storytelling, building an actual science fiction arc that sent the park, transformed into a kind of mobile dome and eventually a fugitive vessel, into outer space, escalating steadily toward the confrontation with Anti-Pops that would close out the entire series. Quintel has said this was, to some degree, a surprise even to himself, that he had never originally intended to send these characters to space, but that as the ending approached, the idea kept surfacing until it became the obvious vehicle for raising the stakes as high as they needed to go for a finale that size. It is worth noting, as a piece of speculation rather than confirmed fact, that fans have long debated whether the space arc was planned from much earlier in the show's run or improvised more or less in real time once the ending became certain. Based on Quintel's own public comments, the honest answer sits somewhere in between. Certain elements, like the presence of the containment dome, were introduced gradually across season 7, specifically as a slow building hint toward the eventual turn, while the full scope of the space arc and the specifics of the Pops and anti-Pops mythology appear, by the creator's own account, to have crystallized relatively late, once the end was already decided, rather than existing as a fully formed master plan from the pilot onward. Following regular show's conclusion, Quintel went on to create Close Enough, an animated sitcom aimed at a somewhat older audience, following a married couple in their early 30s, navigating parenthood and the general strangeness of no longer being young. The show shared Quintel's characteristic move of grounding a mundane situation and then letting it spiral into something surreal, and by his own description in interviews, it was directly informed by his own life changing across the run of regular show as he settled down and started a family of his own during those same 7 years. Close Enough had a complicated path to air, developed originally for one network before eventually landing on HBO Max, and it ran for 3 seasons before being canceled, with the series later removed from the platform's library entirely. It is a small, somewhat sad footnote, unrelated to regular show's own legacy directly, but worth including because it closes the loop on what Quintel actually did with the years immediately following the show that made his name, and it underlines something true about the ending of regular show itself. It was, by every available account, a choice made from a position of some control, rather than a story cut short against its creator's will. That matters, because it changes how you should read the finale's own emotional register. A show forced to wrap up abruptly tends to leave threads visibly dangling, rushed reconciliations, unearned time skips, a sense of things being tied off rather than genuinely resolved. Regular show's finale does not read that way, and the reason, based on everything Quintel has said publicly, is that it was not written under that kind of pressure. The team knew roughly how much runway they had left and used essentially all of it deliberately, which is part of why the ending manages to feel unhurried even while covering a literal battle for the fate of the universe. Now, having sat with the show's biggest cosmic reveal and its most consequential behind-the-scenes decision, it is worth turning to a smaller, more personal arc, one that fans have spent a genuinely surprising amount of time discussing precisely because of how quietly the show earns it. Rigby's high school diploma. For the first several seasons of the series, Rigby's lack of a diploma functions mostly as a passing joke, a small biographical footnote establishing him as the more irresponsible half of the central duo. He dropped out. He never finished. It comes up occasionally, usually for a laugh, and the show does not seem, for a long time, particularly interested in doing anything more with it than that. Then, in the 7th season finale, an episode called Rigby's Graduation Day Special, the show takes that small joke and gives it the same kind of unhurried, sincere weight it usually reserves for its biggest emotional swings. Rigby, now a full adult in his mid-20s, is invited back to complete the diploma he never finished, and is asked to give a live televised graduation speech as part of the ceremony, framed by the in-universe media as an inspirational story about someone who came back after dropping out, which most people, according to the show, never actually do. The episode does something small and specific that a lot of viewers point to as evidence of the show's underlying maturity. It lets Mordecai be genuinely, uncomfortably jealous of his best friend's accomplishment, rather than simply supportive throughout. Mordecai, watching Rigby succeed at something that took real, sustained effort, admits, in a moment, the show does not rush past, that some part of him liked quietly being the more accomplished one between them, and that watching Rigby actually follow through on something difficult made him confront an unflattering truth about his own competitiveness. This is not a cosmic revelation. It is not a battle with a god. It is two adult men in their 20s working through a small, ordinary, deeply recognizable strain of friendship, the kind that has nothing to do with monsters and everything to do with watching someone you love outgrow you a little and having to decide in real time whether you can be happy for them anyway. Rigby's own speech, once he gives it, leans into exactly that theme, describing how easy it had been not to finish high school the first time and how much harder and more worthwhile it turned out to be to go back and actually do it. What follows the diploma itself, in the show's own internal chronology, is the beginning of the final stretch of Rigby's arc. He eventually moves in with Eileen, the shy, patient mole who had loved him with obvious and unhurried honesty for years by that point. And by the time the finale's 25-year time skip arrives, the two of them are shown married with a family of their own. It is, among all the show's endings for its ensemble, one of the ones fans return to most often as evidence of the show's underlying argument about growth. That change does not require a single dramatic turning point, so much as years of small, deliberately chosen effort applied consistently by someone who is loved enough and patient enough with himself to keep trying even after failing the first time. From Rigby's most grounded arc, it is worth turning briefly to the show's one theatrical attempt at expanding its own story, Regular Show. The movie, released in 2015, because the film gets discussed online far less than the series itself, and because its actual plot is often summarized inaccurately or vaguely by people who have not seen it in years. The film centers on a time travel premise. In a possible future, an older Rigby, having apparently spiraled into serious conflict with an equally aged, cybernetic version of Mordecai, travels back through time with the rest of the park crew to intervene in a moment from Mordecai and Rigby's actual high school years, when a volleyball coach named Mr. Ross first became fixated on Rigby over a costly mistake involving the team's championship hopes. The film escalates that grudge across decades into something approaching apocalyptic stakes, with a weaponized time travel device called a Timinato threatening to erase huge stretches of history. The version of the story that actually lands, though, has very little to do with the science fiction machinery around it. What the film is actually building toward is a simple, direct choice. Once present-day Mordecai and Rigby witness what their friendship curdles into if left unresolved for decades, they explicitly commit, on screen, to never letting resentment build up between them the way it apparently does in that possible future. And that choice alone is enough to erase the entire timeline the film had spent its runtime building toward. It is worth being honest that the film's structure genuinely does anticipate themes the finale would return to 2 years later. The cost of decades of unresolved feeling. The idea that a friendship this long-running requires active maintenance rather than passive continuation, and fans have reasonably speculated that the movie functioned, whether by design or coincidence, as a kind of dry run for emotional ideas the writers would return to with much higher stakes in the actual series finale. Whether that overlap was deliberate or simply the natural result of the same writers working through similar concerns across a short span of years is not something publicly confirmed and should be treated as an open question rather than settled fact. Which brings us, gently, to the part of this story that fans have spent the most real energy arguing about across message boards and comment sections for the better part of a decade. Who did Mordecai actually end up with? For most of the show's run, Mordecai's romantic arc is built around a genuine, prolonged tension between two very different women. Margaret is a Robin who works at the local coffee shop, grounded, ambitious, kind, and, for much of the show's early seasons, clearly a little out of reach for a young man who spends most of his free time playing video games in his boss's basement. CJ is a cloud being, literally composed of vapor and weather, capable of shifting shape, and, when upset, capable of generating actual storms, and her relationship with Mordecai is defined by an intensity and volatility that Margaret's never quite carries. Fans have spent years debating which of the two the show was quietly building toward, and the honest answer, once the finale actually arrives, is neither. In the time skip that closes out the series, Mordecai is shown as a working artist, having left the park to finally take his painting seriously and settled into a life with a partner the show had never previously introduced by name in any earlier season. A bat named Steph, described in coverage of the finale as a fellow artist. Margaret, notably, is shown in that same period having left the park's orbit years earlier to pursue journalism school, a choice the show treats with real respect, letting her exit Mordecai's story on her own terms rather than keeping her tethered to him for the sake of a tidy romantic resolution. CJ, meanwhile, does not appear at all in the finale's version of the future, her relationship with Mordecai having ended sometime before the story's final chapter, off-screen, without the show spelling out exactly why. Before going further, it is worth clearing up a mystery that is not really a mystery at all, except that a huge number of casual retellings of this show get it slightly wrong, and the actual, correct version turns out to be more interesting than the myth that has replaced it in a lot of people's memories. Somewhere along the way, a version of the show's origin story started circulating that has Mordecai and Rigby discovering a strange old magical instrument tucked away in the attic of their house, some ancient object that had apparently been sitting there for years before they ever found it. It is a nice image. It fits the mood the show eventually earns. It is also not what happens. The actual first episode of the entire series aired the 6th of September 2010 and titled, appropriately, The Power, opens with something considerably less mystical and considerably funnier. Rigby, in a flashback the episode itself shows on screen, simply steals a magic electronic keyboard from a wizard who has stepped away from it for a moment to relieve himself in a bush. That is the entire origin of the single most important recurring artifact in the show's mythology. Not a family heirloom, not something waiting patiently in a dusty attic for the right two slackers to stumble across it. A theft of opportunity, committed against a distracted stranger by a raccoon who apparently did not think twice about it. What the keyboard actually does, once Mordecai and Rigby start experimenting with it, is grant something closer to absolute command over reality than either of them seems prepared to handle responsibly. They discover, almost by accident, that it does not simply let them talk people into things the way they first assume. It can bend the actual physical world to match whatever they say while holding it. The first use is almost sweet in its smallness, covering up a hole they punched in their bedroom wall by talking Pops and Benson into approving a raise to pay for repairs. The escalation happens within the same episode, when an attempt to send Skips back to his own room, using the keyboard's power to simply make it so, gets garbled into sending him to the moon instead, stranding him there with a hostile creature until the crew can mount a rescue using, of all things, the same golf cart they use for groundskeeping, retrofitted with the keyboard's own power to make the trip. Skips, once safely back on Earth, destroys the keyboard himself in frustration at how carelessly it had just nearly gotten him killed, which becomes the show's first quiet lesson about this particular object. It does not stay gone. It resurfaces across the series, in one form or another, for years afterward, badly damaged in a box of old junk in one episode, briefly repurposed by other characters entirely in another, and, most significantly, present again in the show's own finale, where Mordecai and Rigby use it to travel backward through a glitch in the timeline and correct the fight between Pops and Anti-Pops before the universe can reset itself the way it always had before. From here, the honest, text-confirmed version of the story ends, and anything beyond it slides into the territory of fan reading, which is worth flagging clearly before going any further. What fans have built on top of that simple theft is a persistent theory that the keyboard is considerably older and more significant than a single wizard's lost property, that its reappearance at the exact hinge point of the finale is not coincidence but design, evidence that something in the show's own cosmology had been quietly keeping this particular object in reserve for the one moment it would actually be needed to break an unbreakable cycle. It is a satisfying reading, and the show's own structure gives it some support, since the keyboard genuinely does return at the single most consequential moment in the entire series, doing exactly the kind of reality-bending work it always could, just finally deployed at a scale that matters. But nothing in the text confirms an intentional, pre-planned mythology connecting a wizard's stolen keyboard to a 14 billion-year-old cosmic war between two brothers from another planet. It may simply be that a good recurring prop, once established, becomes the obvious tool to reach for whenever a later story needs exactly what that prop does, without requiring a hidden master plan to explain the coincidence. Both readings can be true at once, honestly. Writers plant tools early because tools are useful, and audiences, quite reasonably, notice when a tool planted early turns out to matter enormously later, and start looking for intention in a pattern that may have grown more organically than that. There is a second recurring magical object worth mentioning in the same breath, a massive mallet that Skips is occasionally shown producing from seemingly nowhere, always. At the exact moment, ordinary problem solving has failed, and something closer to a cosmic intervention is required. The show never explains where it comes from or how long Skips has had access to it, and this, unlike the keyboard's origin, actually is left genuinely open by the text rather than simply mythologized after the fact by fans. It is fair and clearly speculative to note that an object this powerful, sitting quietly in the hands of the show's oldest, most patient character, fits a broader pattern fans have pointed to for years. That Skips occupies a role in this story closer to a steward than a groundskeeper, someone entrusted, whether by the guardians of eternal youth or by some other unstated authority, with tools the rest of the cast is never given and, more tellingly, never even seems to question the existence of. That pattern of stewardship connects naturally to something the show does over and over without ever quite announcing it as a formal theme, which is build almost the entire cast around pairs. Mordecai and Rigby, obviously, the central duo the whole premise is built on, Pops and Anti-Pops, two halves of the same cosmic origin, fated to define each other across billions of years. Skips and the memory of walks. Effectively the same person, separated by centuries and a single tragic night, rather than two people at all. Margaret and CJ, standing for two entirely different versions of the life Mordecai might have chosen. Muscle Man and High Five Ghost, an odd, enduring friendship the show never treats as strange, despite one of them being visibly dead. It is worth being honest that noticing a pattern of pairs across a large ensemble cast is not, on its own, especially remarkable. Most ensemble comedies build their casts around complementary duos because contrast generates comedy naturally. What makes the pattern worth lingering on here, as pure interpretation rather than anything the show states outright, is how consistently those pairings end up being the emotional engine of the specific arcs the show treats as most serious. Every one of the show's heaviest moments, the finale's climactic embrace between two brothers included, resolves through connection between exactly two people rather than through any individual's private growth. If there is a quiet argument buried in that pattern, offered here as speculation rather than the show's confirmed thesis, it might be something like this: that the show keeps circling back to the idea that nobody in its universe finishes becoming themselves entirely alone, that growth here is never solitary, that even a 14 billion-year-old cosmic war only ends once one half of it is finally willing to actually reach for the other. One relationship inside that larger pattern deserves its own attention because it involves a character whose arc genuinely surprised a portion of the audience with how far it traveled. Eileen, the shy, bespectacled mole, who first appears as a minor supporting character, a friend of Margaret's working at the coffee shop, developing an unrequited crush on Rigby that the show initially plays purely for laughs. Across the show's run, and this part is simply documented plot rather than interpretation, Eileen becomes steadily more central, evolving from a background gag into one of the show's most fully written characters, someone the show treats, by its final seasons, with the same seriousness it extends to any of its founding cast. What fans have argued, and this shifts into reading rather than stated fact, is that Eileen functions across the entire series as the show's model of what it actually looks like to say the true thing out loud without flinching. She tells Rigby she likes him well before he is emotionally ready to hear it. She tells him plainly when he has hurt her. She does not perform indifference to protect herself the way most of the show's other romantic entanglements involve at least one party doing at some point. Rigby's own arc, completing his diploma, learning to show up, eventually marrying her, and building a family in the show's own confirmed time skip, can reasonably be read as the slow, uneven process of a young man learning to do, with real difficulty, something Eileen appears to have simply known how to do from the moment she first appears on screen. The show never states this contrast directly. It simply lets her be steady, scene after scene, for years, while everyone else around her stumbles toward the same kind of honesty at considerably greater cost. It is worth pausing here on a theme that runs quietly underneath nearly everything the show does with its central relationships, because once you notice it, a huge number of individual episodes start to look less like isolated jokes and more like small variations on the same underlying concern. This is, among other things, a show almost entirely populated by young men who do not know how to say what they actually feel and who are, gradually and with real difficulty, taught how to anyway. Mordecai spends years failing to tell Margaret anything true about how he feels, defaulting instead to avoidance, mixed signals, and a running joke about ordering muffins. He does not really want just to have a reason to stay in the coffee shop a little longer. Rigby avoids his own unfinished education for years rather than confront the shame of having quit. Muscle Man performs an exaggerated, constantly escalating toughness that the show, notably, never actually validates as genuine strength. It lets him cry easily, love deeply, and eventually mourn his father's death with an openness the character's own bravado would never have predicted in the show's early seasons. Even Pops, in his own register, spends the entire series retreating into naive cheerfulness rather than confronting what he actually is, right up until the moment the show finally forces the confrontation on him, whether he is ready or not. None of this is stated by the show as an explicit thesis about masculinity, and it is worth being careful not to overstate authorial intent here. It is, however, a pattern consistent enough across nearly every major male character's arc that it is hard to read as accidental, and it may be the single most quietly ambitious thing this particular workplace comedy ever attempted. Using a premise built almost entirely around avoidance, video games, and refusing to grow up as the actual vehicle for showing, patiently, what it costs a person not to say the true thing, and what it looks like, a little at a time, when they finally do. That performance of toughness gets a specific, concrete origin point in a Season 3 episode called Trucker Hall of Fame, and it is worth walking through the actual details because the episode complicates the character in a way a quick summary usually flattens. Muscle Man's father, referred to throughout simply as Muscle Dad, dies partway through the episode, mauled by an actual bear after mistaking it for a police officer in costume and pranking it with a cactus, which is exactly the kind of absurd, specific, faintly ridiculous death this show tends to give even its most emotionally serious moments. At the funeral, and in the trip that follows to spread his father's ashes, Muscle Man discovers something his father had apparently hidden from him for his entire life. Muscle Dad was never actually a long-haul trucker. The profession Muscle Man had spent years bragging about and building part of his own identity around. He was a forklift operator, mocked by actual truckers for the difference, and had faked photographs and stories for years, specifically so his son would have something to be proud of. Muscle Dad leaves behind a note, discovered only after Muscle Man, in a fit of grief and rage, destroys the framed photograph that had been the lie's centerpiece, apologizing for the deception and asking his son to spread his ashes at the Trucker Hall of Fame anyway, as one final prank aimed at the actual truckers who had looked down on him. Muscle Man does exactly that, and his father's ghost briefly returns from beyond death, specifically to help enact posthumous revenge on the men who had mistreated him before the episode lets him go for good. It is worth being direct that the show frames this material for real pathos, not merely as a joke with a sad beat attached. Muscle Man's grief is shown as genuine, disorienting, and messy, rather than played purely for laughs. What is fair to add as interpretation, though, is how neatly this backstory rhymes with everything the show does with Muscle Man's own personality in every other episode. A father who spent years performing a more impressive version of himself, specifically to be loved and respected by his son, raised a son who spends the entire series performing a more impressive version of himself in almost exactly the same way, insisting he is a tough guy despite lacking any real muscle, insisting on a nickname that describes something he is not. The show never explicitly draws that line for you. It simply gives you the two facts, years apart, and lets you notice, if you are watching closely enough, that the show's loudest, most insecure performer of masculinity learned that particular habit from somewhere very specific and very sad and very close to home. A related and slightly more grounded thread, worth naming honestly because it rarely gets discussed with the seriousness it deserves, concerns money. The staff of this park are not paid particularly well. They live in housing the park itself provides, which means losing their jobs would cost them their home in the same stroke. They are, across multiple episodes, threatened credibly with being fired for reasons that range from legitimate mismanagement to the simple bad luck of working for an owner who occasionally treats the entire operation as disposable. Mordecai and Rigby specifically are shown, again and again, to be financially unable to simply leave and start over somewhere else, tied to this particular strange job by economic necessity as much as by loyalty or habit. This is not subtext requiring a theory to locate. It is simply the stated economic situation of the show's protagonists, present from very early episodes onward. What is genuinely a matter of reading, rather than confirmed authorial statement, is the observation some critics and fans have made that the show's cosmic threats and its economic precarity are, functionally, operating at the same emotional register, even though they look nothing alike on the surface. Losing the job is staged, more than once, with a seriousness that rivals the show's actual apocalyptic stakes, because for two young men with nowhere else to go, it effectively is apocalyptic. Whether the writers intended that parallel as deliberate social commentary on the economic reality facing many people in their 20s during the years the show aired, or whether it emerged simply from writing believable stakes for characters who happen to be broke, is not something publicly confirmed by anyone credited on the series. It is, at minimum, a consistent enough through line across 8 seasons that it is worth naming plainly rather than letting the show's cosmic mythology completely eclipse the much smaller, much more familiar kind of fear running underneath it the entire time. Stepping back from the show's emotional interior for a moment, it is worth addressing a mystery that is really a production history question, because the show's own visual identity and origin story get flattened online into a much simpler tale than what actually happened. Regular's show did not begin as a fully formed pitch for a network executive to approve from a blank page. It began with a set of student animated shorts J.G. Quintel made while attending CalArts, including one called The Naive Man from Lollyland, which is, as the title makes plain, the direct ancestor of Pops, and another rougher, more explicitly adult-leaning short called Two in the AM/PM, which introduced early, cruder versions of characters who would eventually become Benson and Mordecai. Those shorts led to a spot in a short-lived, deliberately experimental Cartoon Network initiative called Cartoonstitute, a program specifically designed to let independent artists pitch and produce a single animated short with essentially no creative interference, in the hope that a handful of them might be developed into full series. Quintel has described pitching what would become Regular show by leaning fully into how strange the premise sounded out loud rather than trying to disguise it, describing it, by his own account, roughly as a show about a blue jay and a raccoon working at a city park alongside a talking gumball machine, an immortal yeti, and a man with a lollipop for a head, on the theory that if the pitch itself could not survive being said plainly, the show probably was not going to work either. It survived. Cartoonstitute itself was eventually discontinued, having completed only a fraction of its originally planned slate of shorts. But Regular Show was one of the handful that got picked up and developed into an ongoing series, premiering on Cartoon Network on September 6th, 2010. What fans have noticed, comparing that earliest surviving pilot material to the show that eventually aired week after week for 7 years, is that something in the tone shifted somewhere along the way, becoming gentler, less abrasive, more clearly built for a general audience, even while retaining a level of innuendo and casual vulgarity that occasionally surprised parents watching alongside their kids. Whether that shift represents deliberate network smoothing of rougher original material, natural creative evolution as the writing staff grew and found the show's actual voice over time, or some combination of both, is not something publicly documented in enough detail to state with confidence, and it is worth treating claims of a deliberately softened, secretly edgier, original vision with appropriate caution. Interviews with Quintel and the broader creative team, as far as could be verified, describe the show's tonal development as organic rather than the product of a specific, documented conflict with network standards. What is simply true is that the show's visual and tonal identity did continue to develop steadily across its run, becoming markedly more serialized, more science fiction inflected, and more willing to sit in genuine emotional weight by its final seasons than the pilot era material had any obvious reason to predict. One more small mystery worth resolving cleanly before moving toward closing things out tonight, because it produces more confused summaries online than almost anything else discussed in this video. Whether Regular Show's feature film ever actually played in theaters the way a normal studio movie would. The honest answer is a limited, brief, theatrical run rather than a wide release. Regular Show. The movie premiered at a Hollywood theater in Los Angeles in late February of 2015, playing there for a short, specific window rather than opening nationwide, before eventually receiving its wider release through television broadcast and home video formats later that same year. It was never intended to compete for a general theatrical audience the way a major studio animated feature would. It functioned, in practice, as an extended television special dressed up with a brief, symbolic theatrical premiere, which is a fairly common path for animated properties originating on a cable network rather than a film studio. The confusion online tends to come from people assuming, reasonably enough given the word movie in the title, that it followed the same release path as a major animated feature, when in practice it followed something closer to the release path of a network television special with a nice premiere party attached. There is one more theme worth naming plainly before returning to Mordecai's ending, because it may be the single through line connecting everything discussed so far tonight, from a stolen keyboard to a cosmic war to a diploma finally finished at 25. Regular Show, across its entire run, keeps returning obsessively to games, board games, video game tournaments, eating contests, high scores, wagers with cosmic beings who treat a bet as seriously as a blood oath. It happens so often, across so many otherwise unrelated episodes, that once you start actually counting, it becomes genuinely difficult to treat as a stylistic tick, rather than something closer to the show's actual operating logic. Characters do not simply solve problems in this universe, they compete their way out of them, again and again, as though winning the right contest is treated, structurally, as a kind of contract with reality itself. This observation is interpretation rather than a stated authorial thesis, but it is interpretation with an unusually large body of supporting evidence sitting directly in the text, episode after episode, for 8 full seasons, and it connects back, in a small and quiet way, to everything this video keeps circling. A show that keeps insisting, over and over, that those small competitive rituals actually matter, that the right game played sincerely enough can genuinely change what happens next, is not so very far removed, thematically, from a finale that ultimately resolves its largest possible stakes, not through greater force, but through one specific, deliberately chosen act between two brothers who had been fighting the same unwinnable contest for 14 billion years before either of them thought to try something as small and as strange and as enormous as simply choosing not to fight at all. Before turning to death, it is worth spending a moment on a location that functions across the show's run, almost like a second park, the coffee shop where Margaret works in the earlier seasons and where Eileen works alongside her. This is documented plot, not theory. Mordecai spends an enormous amount of the show's early runtime there, ordering coffee and muffins he does not always particularly want, using the transaction as a flimsy excuse to stay in the same room as Margaret a little longer. What is fair to add as reading, rather than stated text, is how closely the coffee shop mirrors the park's own function in Mordecai's emotional life. Both are places built around routine tasks that quietly become excuses for avoidance rather than progress. Both are staffed by patient, somewhat weary authority figures who watch the same small dramas repeat without much power to intervene. Both are spaces where the actual work that needs doing, whether that work is groundskeeping or being honest with someone you love, keeps getting quietly deferred in favor of whatever smaller, safer task is immediately in front of you. The show never states this parallel outright, and it would be overreaching to claim the writers built the coffee shop specifically as a structural echo of the park. But the resemblance holds up remarkably well across multiple seasons of material, and it offers a useful, if speculative, answer to a question that might otherwise nag at an attentive viewer. Why does a show, ostensibly about groundskeeping, spend quite so much of its early run inside a completely unrelated small business? The answer, in this reading, is that it is not unrelated at all. It is simply the same problem, wearing a different apron. A related pattern worth naming because it recurs constantly enough across the show's 8 seasons to feel like an actual structural habit rather than coincidence, involves parties. Somebody needs to throw one. The staff, however reluctantly, agrees to help. Something supernatural goes wrong partway through, almost without exception, and the party either survives against long odds or transforms outright into a small cosmic confrontation that happens to resolve itself in time for the cake to still get served. This is, again, simply observable pattern rather than something requiring deep archival digging to confirm. A casual rewatch of almost any random handful of episodes turns up at least one built around exactly this shape. What is worth adding, gently, as interpretation, is that these smaller episodes may be doing quieter versions of the exact same emotional work the show's biggest, most cosmic set pieces do at a larger scale. Whether you can let yourself actually enjoy a birthday, stay present at somebody else's celebration instead of retreating into your own head, show up on time and without complaint for something that matters to a friend, even when it is inconvenient, functions, in this reading, as a kind of small stakes rehearsal for exactly the same commitment the show eventually asks of Pops in its finale. The show treats its lightest party episodes with more care than pure filler usually receives, which is itself a reasonable piece of evidence, even if it falls short of proof, that the writers understood these smaller tests, and the finale's largest one, as versions of the same underlying question asked at different volumes. One further theme, running quietly beneath dozens of individual episodes across the entire run, deserves to be named plainly before moving forward. Forgiveness. Brothers reconcile. Old friends who have drifted or fought find their way back to something resembling trust. Lovers who have hurt each other manage, eventually, to arrive somewhere calmer. Even outright enemies, across the show's mythology, occasionally settle into something closer to grudging respect than lingering hatred. None of this requires much digging to confirm. Reconciliation episodes are simply common enough across the series that they form a recognizable pattern in their own right. What is squarely interpretation, offered here as a reading rather than a stated thesis, is the observation that forgiveness in this particular show seems to be treated as a more structurally significant force than outright victory. The finale itself supports that reading rather well. Pops does not defeat his brother through greater strength in any straightforward sense. He ends a war that had lasted 14 billion years through an act that looks, by any reasonable description, considerably closer to forgiveness and reconciliation than to combat. The show never uses that specific word on screen. It does not need to. The shape of the final embrace, and the fact that it is the only thing that has ever worked across dozens of prior cycles of exactly the same fight, does the naming for it. It is worth returning, briefly, to Death himself, because the show's treatment of him is one of the clearest pieces of evidence that this particular park operates by rules the rest of the world quietly does not. Death appears across the series as a British accented figure on a motorcycle, dressed like an aging biker, who arrives whenever a soul is due to be collected, and who treats the whole business less like cosmic horror and more like an occupational routine he has grown mildly weary of over a very long career. He has, according to the show's own established lore, a wife and a 300-year-old son named Thomas, whom Death himself apparently does not realize is capable of speech, a small, strange detail. The show drops in without much fanfare and never really circles back to explain further. Death has, at various points, wagered for souls, been talked out of collecting a debt through games and clever loopholes, and been invited to purely social occasions at the park, a wedding, a birthday celebration, as though he were simply another eccentric regular rather than the actual personification of mortality. It is fair and clearly speculative to read something gentle in that detail. A show that gives its own version of death, a family, a home life, and small ordinary worries is, whether deliberately or not, making the quiet suggestion that even the entity in charge of endings is not exempt from the small, warm structures of a life worth living, and that his relative reasonableness with the staff of this particular park might have something to do with understanding, personally, exactly what it costs the people left behind whenever he does his job. Nowhere is this blurred boundary between the ordinary and the supernatural more visible than in the show's Halloween and Christmas specials, which the show treats with a level of mythological seriousness noticeably higher than its own weekly baseline. In the Christmas specials, Santa Claus is depicted not as a symbol or a bit of holiday whimsy, but as an actual being with real, demonstrated cosmic level power, treated by the show with something closer to awe than the gentle irony A workplace comedy might usually reserve for a mall Santa gag. In the Halloween specials, characters genuinely die within the episode. Stakes escalate further than the show's normal comic register typically allows, and the tone shifts perceptibly darker for the duration of the special before returning the following week to business as usual. None of this is theory. It is simply how those specific episodes are staged consistently across the show's run. What is fair to read into that pattern, while being clear that it is reading rather than stated authorial intent, is that these annual specials function as brief, deliberate admissions of what the show usually keeps at arm's length the rest of the year, that the ordinary rules of life and death simply do not fully apply at this park, and that the specials are the one recurring moment each year when the show stops treating that fact as background texture and lets it become, briefly, the actual point. A closely related and much loved recurring figure worth mentioning by name is Garrett Bobby Ferguson, the disembodied, gigantic, floating head who returns across multiple video game-centered episodes as a former arcade record holder unable to accept having lost his own high score. He dies, becomes a ghost, and returns from beyond death specifically to reclaim a record that, in any ordinary human life, would have stopped mattering decades earlier. The character sits at the intersection of two things the show clearly loves: video games as an actual structural language for how its universe resolves conflict, and the specific, very 1980s strain of nostalgia the show returns to constantly in its soundtrack choices, its arcade cabinet aesthetics, and its running fondness for synthesizer-driven villains and boombox culture. Reading Garrett Bobby Ferguson as a kind of cautionary figure, a warning about what happens to a person who never lets go of the exact moment they were once impressively good at something, is squarely fan interpretation, though it is a reading the character's own design invites rather forcefully, given that the show quite literally has him return from the dead, specifically because he could not tolerate his own past achievement, fading into the past where it belonged. A brief, more grounded note on how the show was actually made is worth including here, mostly because it explains why individual episodes have the specific handmade texture longtime viewers tend to describe fondly without always knowing why. Each episode was built through a hand-drawn storyboard process developed at Cartoon Network Studios in Burbank, with the storyboards then sent to Seiram Animation in South Korea for the more complex animation work, a fairly standard pipeline for American television animation of that era, but one that meant a single completed episode, by some published accounts of the production process, could take roughly 9 months from initial script to final broadcast-ready footage. The show's score was composed by Mark Mothersbaugh, known for a long career scoring animated and live-action projects, and the series also made consistent use of licensed real-world music, which is part of why the finale's choice of David Bowie's Heroes lands with the specific weight it does. It sits inside a show that had spent years already treating carefully chosen existing songs as meaningful rather than incidental. The series also faced some international content adjustments outside the United States, with certain broadcasts in some territories editing dialogue and trimming scenes to soften content considered too mature for the specific local time slot the show was airing in, a reminder that a show built by its own creator's account from very personal and occasionally quite adult early student films never entirely lost that undercurrent, even once it settled into a long run on a network aimed primarily at children. It is worth returning, one more time, to the Guardians of Eternal Youth, because there is a piece of speculation built around them that is worth naming clearly as speculation before it gets mistaken for something the show actually confirms. The Guardians are established, plainly, as the group responsible for granting Skips his immortality and equipping him with the fists of justice needed to fight Clorgbane every 157 years. They are shown as five infant-shaped beings with unsettling adult voices. They attended the same school as Skips centuries ago, and they reappear periodically across the series, including during the finale's climactic battle, where they join the wider coalition assembled to help Pops. What is not confirmed by the text, and is instead a reading fans have built on top of that established foundation, is the idea that the Guardians represent a much larger, older, cosmic institution, one that has been quietly maintaining similar arrangements with similarly entrusted immortal guardians in other quiet places across human history, of which Skips and this particular park are simply one visible example among many. The show never bothers to show you. It is an appealing reading, in part because it would explain why beings this powerful seem so unbothered by concepts the rest of the cast finds overwhelming, and in part because the show's finale does gesture, briefly and without lingering on it, toward a wider assembly of allied cosmic forces that clearly existed and operated long before Mordecai and Rigby ever wandered into any of it. But it remains, as of everything publicly available about the show, an extrapolation rather than a confirmed piece of the show's actual mythology, and it is worth holding it exactly that loosely. A gentler, more modest mystery worth naming before moving on involves the show's enormous population of minor recurring characters: the snack bar workers, the hot dog vendors, the various townspeople who drift in and out of episodes across 8 seasons without ever becoming central to the plot. This is simply observable fact rather than theory. The show gives an unusually large number of these background figures, names, individual personalities, and the occasional small dedicated storyline of their own, far more than its premise strictly required it to. What fans have built from that observable generosity as pure interpretation is the sense that the writers were quietly constructing a fuller, more inhabited world around the park than the show ever had the runtime to fully explore. A community of ordinary people whose own small lives continue running in parallel to Mordecai and Rigby's, whether or not the two of them ever notice. Whether that was ever a deliberate authorial project or simply the natural accumulation of 8 years of writers enjoying the process of giving small, throwaway characters a little extra texture is not something publicly documented one way or the other. What can be said honestly is that the effect, intentional or not, is part of why the park itself feels, to a lot of longtime viewers, less like a set built to service a plot and more like an actual place that happened to have a camera pointed at it for 7 years. The reaction to the choice of who Mordecai actually ends up with, at the time and in the years since, has been genuinely mixed, and it is worth representing that honestly, rather than pretending fandom consensus settled comfortably on one reading. Some viewers have argued that introducing a new character in the finale's final minutes, with essentially no prior screen time, felt like an anticlimax after years of investment in the Margaret and CJ dynamic specifically. Others, and this reading has aged somewhat better in retrospect based on ongoing fan discussion, have argued that the choice was exactly the point, that the show, having spent years dramatizing the agonizing pull between two very different kinds of partners, was quietly making an argument that most people in real life do not end up with either version of the person they spent their 20s agonizing over, and instead end up with someone steadier, someone who arrives once the frantic searching itself has quieted down. Both readings are, at this point, simply competing interpretations of a deliberate, authorial choice, and neither has been confirmed or denied by the creators in any statement I was able to verify. What can be said plainly, because it is simply what happens on screen, is that the show declined to resolve its most publicly debated romantic question in the way either side of the fandom had spent years expecting, and gave Mordecai, instead, an ending built around a relationship the audience had never been allowed to anticipate. It is worth pausing before moving to the show's most recent and strangest development on how this series was actually received while it was airing, because the popular memory of Regular Show as a cult favorite occasionally undersells how seriously the industry itself took the show at the time. Across its run, the series received multiple Emmy Award nominations and won at least one for the episode Excellent, which Quintel himself has named, in interviews given around the finale, as one of the two episodes he remained proudest of across the entire show's run, the other being The Power, the very first episode, the one that introduced the stolen keyboard this video has already spent some time on tonight. That an episode built around a giant plate of eggs, a trucker hat, and a coma induced by competitive eating could sit, in its creator's own estimation, alongside the show's literal series premiere as a career highlight, tells you something true about the kind of show this actually was underneath its cosmic mythology. The biggest emotional stakes were never really about how large the threat was, but about how much the characters were willing to risk, physically and emotionally, for each other over something as small as a hat. The show's afterlife has been unusually active for a series that concluded, on its own terms, in early 2017. It has remained a consistent presence in streaming libraries in the years since, continued to generate new fan analysis and long-form video essays across platforms that did not even fully exist in the show's early seasons, and, as we have already discussed, generated enough sustained affection and commercial interest that Cartoon Network and Warner Brothers Discovery ultimately chose to bring the original creator and the entire original voice cast back together for a genuine continuation nearly a decade later, rather than attempting a cheaper reboot with new voices standing in for the old ones. That is not a common outcome for a Cartoon Network series of its era, and it is fair to say, without needing to speculate much at all, that it reflects a level of ongoing audience attachment the show's initial ratings, while solid, did not necessarily predict on their own at the time. There is one more piece of unfinished business worth addressing directly, because it changes the entire context in which every theory we have discussed tonight now has to sit, and that is the fact that Regular Show is, as of this year, no longer entirely finished. In May of 2026, 9 years after the original series concluded, Cartoon Network premiered Regular Show, The Lost Tapes, a new continuation of the original show, produced with Quintel himself returning and, remarkably, every member of the original core voice cast reprising their roles. This is not, by the network's own framing and by public statements from the people involved, a reboot or a soft relaunch with new actors standing in for old characters. It is presented as a direct continuation, sitting inside the same canon, the original 8 seasons, and the finale already established. That detail matters enormously for a fandom that had, for 9 years, treated Pops' death and the 25-year time skip as a closed, settled ending. William Salyers, who has voiced Rigby since the very beginning, addressed exactly this concern publicly around the time of the revival's announcement, acknowledging that he had shared the same worry many longtime fans immediately had, that a revival might undo or cheapen an ending. He considered one of the strongest series conclusions he had ever been part of, and stating, based on what he had actually seen of the new material, that this did not turn out to be the case. The revival, in other words, appears to exist alongside the finale rather than reversing it, though the full shape of how it accomplishes that, given that Pops's death is treated as final and permanent within the original finale's own text, remains something the show itself has chosen to reveal gradually rather than explain up front. I want to be honest and specific here about where verified fact ends and speculation begins, because this is exactly the kind of situation where it is tempting to blur the line. It is verified, publicly reported fact that regular show, The Lost Tapes, exists, premiered on Cartoon Network on the 11th of May, 2026, was greenlit for a total of 40 episodes, and features the original voice cast returning within a narrative the creators describe as fitting inside established continuity. It is also verified that the marketing and structure of the premiere deliberately played with the audience's uncertainty about how a story that ended with a death and a 25-year time skip could plausibly continue, teasing that the premiere itself was designed to answer exactly that question. What is not yet fully public, at least not in any source available to verify at the time of this recording, is the specific narrative mechanism by which the revival threads that needle. Fan speculation online has run in several directions. Theories involving time travel loops similar to devices the original show used more than once. Theories involving the show's own established habit of treating certain events as recordings or memories rather than strictly linear plot, and simpler theories suggesting the new episodes may largely take place chronologically earlier than the finale, filling in gaps within the original 8 seasons rather than picking up after them. All three are, as of tonight, genuinely unconfirmed guesses rather than established fact, and I want to be direct that anyone online telling you with total confidence exactly how it works is speculating just as much as the rest of us, however they phrase it. What this means, practically, for a show that spent 9 years being discussed in the past tense, is that its central mystery box has quietly and without much fanfare beyond animation trade press been reopened. The finale's ending still stands. The statue of Pops beside the statue of his father is, as far as anyone can currently verify, still the last confirmed word on that particular character's fate within the original timeline. But the show that produced that ending is, as of this year, actively being extended by the same hands that built it the first time. And that is not a small thing for a series whose entire emotional architecture was built around the idea of an ending that actually meant something. There is a version of this whole subject, stepping back from any single mystery or theory, that is worth naming plainly before we close things out tonight, because it is the thing that seems to unify almost everything we have talked about across these last few hours. Regular Show spent its entire run pretending, quite convincingly, to be a show about two guys avoiding work at a park. Underneath that premise, verifiably, on screen, in text, the show itself commits to, rather than merely hints at, it was building toward a story about a god who chose kindness over a fight he could have kept fighting forever. A father who spent his whole life quietly protecting a secret he could barely carry, end quote. A widower who has spent centuries refusing to walk because walking is what he was doing the last time he was truly happy, and a handful of ordinary, unremarkable young men slowly, unevenly, sometimes painfully, learning how to become the kind of people capable of being loved by the partners, friends, and family who kept showing up for them anyway. None of that required cosmic stakes to be true. The show gave it cosmic stakes anyway, because that is apparently the only scale some kinds of growing up ever feel like from the inside. And because, as it turns out, wrapping something that true in something that silly is exactly how you get an audience to sit still long enough to actually receive it. The park is still there, in the only way a canceled and then quietly resurrected cartoon can still be there, which is to say, in reruns, in a growing wiki, in 40 new episodes, still rolling out as this video goes up. In the memory of anyone who watched Two Slackers grow up slowly enough that it never once felt like a lesson while it was happening. Whatever the lost tapes turn out to actually be doing with continuity, whatever new mystery they end up opening once the full 40 episodes have aired, the version of this show that already exists, the one with the hug that ended a war, and the Yeti who still skips instead of walks, and the boss's boss who never once learned to say a groundskeeper's name correctly until it finally, quietly, no longer mattered whether he did. That version is finished, and it is good, and it earned its ending honestly. Think, for a second, about how small this whole thing actually started. Two guys, a blue jay and a raccoon, a park nobody in the audience had any particular reason to care about, run by a gumball machine with a temper problem, staffed by a Yeti nobody suspected of carrying 5 centuries of quiet grief, watched over by an old man in a top hat that half the internet spent years assuming was just a joke about a lollipop. None of it announced itself as anything more than a pleasant way to waste 22 minutes on a Monday afternoon. That is, in its own way, the most honest thing this show ever did, and maybe the reason it still gets watched, argued about, and returned to years after it should have quietly faded the way most Cartoon Network comedies from that era eventually did. It never once told you how big it was actually going to get. It let you find out the way you find most of the important things in your own life, gradually, almost by accident, usually a few years later than you expected to. Consider, one last time, the specific image this video opened with tonight: an immortal man, centuries old, refusing to walk anywhere, ever, because walking is the last thing he remembers doing before the worst night of his very long life. That detail did not need a cosmic war to be moving. It did not need Lollyland, or a 14 billion year cycle, or a titanic battle staged against the backdrop of a dying sun. It only needed a school dance, a piece of falling ceiling, and a promise a young man made to himself in the wreckage of it, a promise nobody made him keep, that he has now kept anyway for longer than most civilizations managed to last. Everything else, this show, eventually built on top of that: the cosmic mythology, the space arc, the war between brothers, arrived later and arrived louder, but the quiet original grief underneath Skips's name was always the realest thing in the room, and it is worth remembering, now that the tour is nearly over, that the show never actually needed to raise its voice to earn the way it has stayed with people this long. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that a show this committed to smallness, this in love with the texture of an ordinary afternoon with nothing much happening, turned out to be hiding a story about a war that had been fought 14 billion years before either of its two lead characters were born. It suggests, if you let it, that the two scales were never actually as far apart as they looked. The stakes of an unpaid rent check, a diploma left unfinished for years out of shame, a friendship that has to decide, again and again, whether it is worth the trouble of staying honest, are not smaller than the stakes of a cosmic war, just because nobody is going to write a battle sequence about them. They simply happen quietly, over years, instead of over one enormous space finale. In a register this show clearly understood, long before it ever had the confidence to send its own characters into orbit to prove it. Somewhere tonight, in whichever timeline you want to imagine holding it, the cart is parked at the edge of the lot, with its battery slowly draining in the dark. The lights in the snack bar are off. Skips is somewhere in the maintenance shed, working on something that does not really need fixing, taking the long way there on foot, the only way he ever takes anywhere. Benson is asleep, dreaming, probably, about a filing system nobody else in the park has ever once respected. And somewhere above all of it, in whatever quiet corner of the show's own mythology holds him now, a man with a lollipop for a head is still watching the people he loved grow old and settle and stay exactly the way he wanted, from exactly far enough away that it never has to hurt him the way it might have if he had stayed. If tonight helped you fall asleep, or at least helped you drift somewhere calmer than where you started, that is genuinely all these videos are for. If you have not subscribed yet, it really does help this channel keep going, so consider doing that before you close your eyes. Take whatever the park gave you tonight with you into wherever you are headed next. Sleep well. The cart will be there in the morning, whichever version of the park you land in when you dream about it.